Welcome to Beyond Belief, Faith After Religious Deconstruction, where we have conversations about pushing the boundaries on doctrine and dogma and exploring beyond religion to find our own unique path or authentic faith expression. And joining me today is Julie Cluff. Julie is a grief specialist. She's a speaker, she's an intuitive angel guide, and she has also written a book that I really love. It has to do with her own experiences with grief and how she overcame that. It's called Miracles in the Darkness. And today she's here to share her story with us about her faith journey and how that shifted. Thank you so much for joining me today, Julie.
Oh, I'm so excited to talk with you again, Pooja. Yes, you are a dear friend, and I'm so appreciative of you and your story and your experiences.
Thank you, Julie. I would love for you to share with us a little bit about what was your religion of your childhood, your upbringing a little bit, and then how and why that shifted.
Yeah. So I was raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly known as the Mormons, the Mormon Church. And that was the faith, that was the religious structure of my life for 6 decades. I was very, very involved in my religion and in my community. I held numerous leadership roles in that community from the time I was 25 years old. And like I said, I was just very, very involved and connected to that community for a number of years. And and if it's okay if I just kind of move forward with what changed was when my children, well, first of all, let me back up a little bit because when my brother died, I was in my mid 20s when my brother died of suicide. And at the time of his passing, the common dogma, the common, belief from the leadership was that his soul was lost, that, there was a possibility because God is fair and knows our heart, but there very much was kind of this connection with death by suicide and murder. And it was very, very very much this idea that he was lost. And I knew my brother, and I struggled. I literally struggled with that for years and years and years. And sadly, I struggled with that for a long time, not, hoping beyond hope that he was okay, but also having this conditioning that, he likely wasn't. But that just like never sat well with me, and I didn't know what to do with that. And so that was, like I said, I was 27 when he passed away. And then a couple years later, I went through a divorce, and this again was frowned on by my community because in the Mormon church, you don't just marry for life, you marry for eternity.
Mm.
And that is done in a Mormon temple. You qualify. Not everybody is allowed to go into a temple. In fact, the day that I married my first husband in the temple, I was the only one in my immediate family there. Both my parents and my siblings, none of them were permitted to go with me for various reasons. My dad wasn't a member of our faith, so he wasn't allowed in because my mother, at the time, this has changed, but at the time, because my mother was married to someone who wasn't a member, she wasn't allowed to attend the temple, and my siblings were not yet at the age where they were, you know, allowed into the temple, I guess is the only way to say it. And it was no fault of anybody's that they weren't allowed in. It was just those were the rules. And so at the time, I was so indoctrinated in the system that I didn't see any problem with that. Like, of course, I was sad that they weren't in the temple with me, but I'm getting married. I was excited about getting married. I felt like I was choosing the right thing. I was doing the right thing. But I look back on it now and it just makes me profoundly sad that that was the experience at that time, and that's what happened. There were so many things over the years, but when my that I questioned and I wondered about from a very young age, but I always put those things aside because I believed everyone around me that this was the path, that this was the way, that I needed to be in this church following these rules. But one of the things that really challenged me was this: if this is the only path, is God so unsuccessful as a parent that only 0.02% of the world population is part of this religious culture? Only 0.2% of the United States population. And of those 2.2% of the United States population, there's only a fraction of those who are actively participating, because once you're on the rolls, you're always on the rolls unless you formally do something to take your name off the rolls. So that always like, I couldn't, it didn't make sense to me. It didn't make sense to me that that we were the chosen one, and now I look at the world and I see that there's a lot of people thinking they're the chosen ones. And that's okay. Like we want to feel special, and the news flash is we are all special because we all are, children of God, or sparks of the divine, or whatever language you put around that. We are all special, and I came to discover over time that we all are special, and that there is no chosen people, there is no chosen way, there is no exact path that God is asking us to follow to return home to Him. I I like to say it this, I like to share it this way. I can't imagine, leaving my earthly home, like leaving my home of childhood and going off to college, and my parents saying, in order for you to come home, you need to jump through these hoops. And if you don't jump through these hoops, if you don't pay this amount of money to this institution, if you don't dress this way, eat this way, conduct yourself in this way, then you can't come home from college. Like, that makes no sense to me. So that was part of my initial deconstruction over time of religion, kind of the backlog history before other things started to happen.
That's such a beautiful analogy, Julie, about the coming home part. You know, the question I have, because I've experienced deconstruction and I know we each will experience it in a different way. But for me, when the questions started arising, I pushed them away. Did you find yourself doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. The Mormon faith is what's sometimes referred to as a high control, high demand religion. And actually, when I heard your story for the first time, you were a guest on another podcast, and I could relate so much to what you were saying, the pressure that you felt, and this connection, like this, the leader saying that if you reject this church, you're rejecting God. Like,
Yes.
I could so much appreciate and identify with that piece of your story, and that was definitely a part of my experience as well. And there were very specific things that we were asked to do, like, in that faith, in that religious tradition, we were asked to dress a certain way. We were asked to abstain from coffee, alcohol, tea,
Mhm.
black tea, green tea. We were asked to, pay a tithing. And if you weren't what they called a full tithe payer, then you couldn't get into the temple. And so all these requirements were required in order for entrance into the temple. And the temple symbolized entrance into heaven.
Mm.
And so if there was something that, there was sexual purity, there was food, there were so many restrictions as far as behavior, and then there was this message that we were only to read or dive into things that were written and produced by the church. And
Mhm.
anything that spoke negatively of the church was considered
Mhm.
anti-Mormon. And the interesting thing is, I've lived a long time. And after 6 decades of watching this church shift and change and people being excommunicated for communicating things that were considered anti when I was 20 were the things that the church was saying when I was 40. And this pattern continued and continues to this day because they could no longer hide the actual history. And it was seeing all of the negative effects of the religion that I practiced, all yeah, well, because of my work as a coach, I worked with a lot of people and mostly women, some men, but mostly women. And I worked with women from all different religious backgrounds, but because of my own association with the Mormon faith, I worked with a lot of women from the Church of Jesus Christ. And so I noticed these patterns that they really questioned themselves. They weren't willing to, and this is very generic. I mean, I'm speaking in broad strokes. Not everyone experiences this, but to some degree or another, there was a putting aside of their own intuition and putting their trust in leaders that said they were speaking for God.
Mhm.
And I was really, really concerned by this. I would have clients that I was working with that were deep in grief and really struggling with their grief, but they were unable to say no to their leaders. And
Mhm.
they needed that space. They needed to be able to back away from all the pressure that, not in a, they needed to let go of all their traditions, but in this religion, we were asked to, the local leadership is a non-paid leadership,
Mhm.
all of it. The pastor, which we called bishop, the all the people that worked within these local congregations
Mhm.
were doing it as a volunteer with virtually no, training
Mhm.
other than the training that the church provided, but no like professional training. So you would have a pastor or a bishop, and that was the vernacular for that was bishop, who had no mental health background or experience. They could be, I mean, I had bishops who were attorneys, I had bishops who were engineers, I had bishops who were, I'm just trying to think back,
Mhm.
who were like um, worked in the tech industry.
Mhm.
They had no real training of any kind in the mental health field, and yet they were meeting with people and offering loving from a place, most of them in my experience, from a very loving place of wanting to serve people, were
Mhm.
offering advice and pastoral care,
Mhm.
but again with no real training. And that in several cases in my own experience was a bit of a problem.
Mhm.
I'll give you an example.
Yes.
When my first marriage, I was married to my first husband for 9 years, and a couple of years before our divorce, I had discovered that he was having an affair. I discovered that he was involved in illegal businesses. I discovered he was involved in other illegal activities, and I was wanting to. I was, this was feeling not sustainable, let's just say. And we had three small children. And I remember talking to my bishop, actually, my bishop at the time came over to my house and urged me to stay in this marriage. And he was very aware of everything that was happening. And he urged me to stay in this marriage and urged and told me that this is what God wanted and that this was the path that I needed to take. And when he left, I remember feeling very confused. But as I went to God with my questions, by the next morning, I was feeling more convinced than ever that it was time to end the marriage and to move forward. And I'm so grateful that I did. It was the best thing for me and my family. And I had other circumstances like that where, one thing I don't think I've mentioned is that on Mother's Day in 2007, my two youngest children died in a car accident. And a couple of years after they passed away, I had a bishop tell me that if I had more faith, I wouldn't be grieving so much. And luckily I have some grit in me, and I'm not I'm like pretty much an independent thinker, even though I stayed in this system for so long. But in that moment, I said, if I didn't have faith, I would not even be here.
Mhm.
And so, I was still what God was telling me was different than what I was hearing from the pulpit.
Mhm.
What God was sharing with me was different than what I was experiencing in church. And that divide became bigger and bigger over time. And I had close family members who left the faith, and I wasn't at all worried about them. But everybody else in the congregation was scared to death. They were, what can we do to help, get them back? And I was like, I think they're fine. I'm like, I'm not worried.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, Julie. The more I listen to your story, the more I feel like, how can I say this? It's almost like it's different because we are different, but some of the things are so similar. I feel like you're telling my story.
I know
Just
that's how I felt when I heard
yeah.
your story.
I wonder if they're reading from the same playbook. But my story happened in the context of evangelical small church.
Hmm.
So it's really amazing to me, just this whole ideology or this whole spirit of religion, right? Where it's our way or no way. It's our dogmas and doctrines, and that even takes precedence over humanity. Like,
Hmm.
imagine what a thing to say to a grieving mom, right? Like, to me, that's cruel. But for them, that's not the place they're coming from. They're probably fiercely trying to protect the faith and the dogma, but it makes you so tunnel visioned. That's the
Yeah, it was
problem.
it was definitely, said with love. I had a lot of experiences like that where I kind of walked away shaking my head, going, that doesn't feel
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
That doesn't sit right with me. As I pray about it, I'm
yeah,
getting a different response,
yeah.
and I trusted what I was receiving.
Mhm.
And
Oh,
the other thing that really, another reason why I really resonated with your story was because of your miraculous healing that you experienced.
mhm.
And I experienced similar thing in that at the 3 years after my kids died, and I had so many miracles, and we've talked about the miracles that happened through all of that experience before, but at the 3 year mark after my children passed away, I was invited by that same bishop to come in and receive a special blessing, a special
Mhm.
prayer. And so my husband and I went to his office, and I was in such a dark place. I mean, it was
Mhm.
tangible. Like the darkness in me was just tangible. And I remember sitting on the back row of the church that day, not even being able to focus on what was happening, and then making my way from that back row over to this bishop's office. And I remember him giving me this, giving me this blessing. And within a couple of hours, I felt different. And within 24 hours, that darkness had completely lifted. And I was made new. And that kept me in even longer than I think maybe I would have been in. Another thing. So your miraculous healing and your experience with that and how that tied you to that community, I get that so deeply because I had that experience as well. And going back even before that, I grew up in a family where my dad, like I mentioned before, was not a member of our faith. He had had very little religious training in his family, and his family was a mess. They were, his dad was an alcoholic that eventually took his own life. It was there was no cohesiveness in his family life, and as a result, my dad was a very unhealed human being with a lot of pain that he took out on us and everyone else, for that matter. And yet my mother came from this Mormon background, and I watched her family, and I watched the beauty in her family, and I watched how, I saw the unity, and I saw the love, and I saw the transformation even in my grandfather, not knowing him before he was a member, but just hearing the stories. And this also tied me to that religious tradition because I looked at it and I said, over here are people who don't have this religious tradition and their life is a mess. And over here, I have this family that is part of this religious tradition and their life looks pretty good. And so that also really tied me to um, that religious tradition, the religious practices, and made me an all-in believer in that practice.
I totally get that, Julie. I feel you. And you were in it for 6 decades. For me, it was just 17 years. And even so, it was so hard to leave, which brings me to that next question. Whenever you were, having these thoughts that this doesn't make sense or that doesn't make sense, did you ever feel like the fear or the anxiety of the thought of losing the community itself, the people, the relationships? Did
You
you?
know, that's an interesting part of my story because no, because I would have these doubts and I would just set them aside
Mm,
because I trusted God so immensely. I just knew that whatever it was I was questioning, that it was all going to work out. And so my trust in God um, has been there from the very beginning. I can't remember a time when I didn't trust God, and that has not changed with my faith transition. I still have a tremendous trust in God. And there's some interesting things that happened that so let me just share kind of what ended up being a boiling point for me where I
Yes,
was like,
please.
I couldn't make it work anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So, 3 years ago, one of a couple of my kids had already left. I had four living children, two who passed away, and then four living children, three from my first marriage and three from my second marriage. But um, two of my four living children had already left the religion. My husband had left the religion. And like I said, I wasn't worried about them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's a story about my husband too that I hope I'll have a chance to share with you. But I wasn't worried about them. But then one of my daughters left, and it was so sudden and so shocking because her whole family had been entrenched
Mm,
in the Mormon faith, including her and her husband and their four children. And then all of a sudden, in what felt like a split second, they said, we're not doing, we're leaving. I mean, they had been in leadership, they had been,
mhm,
um, I feel like influential in their congregation, and and when it just felt like overnight, they said, we're not doing this anymore. Now, remember that I wasn't worried about my family members who had left, but all of a sudden, when this daughter left in this manner so suddenly, I went into full on panic.
mhm,
It was the most bizarre, crazy thing, but my whole system revolted.
mhm,
I was like having a physical response to this, an emotional response to this. Like my whole system just revolted. And I was beside myself for days and weeks. And I remember having thoughts like, they're going to be in so much trouble in the next life because here they were, leadership, influential, and they've left, and they're going to cause other people to leave. And there's going to be consequences for their leaving. And all these fear thoughts were going through my mind. But after that settled, after I had come to a bit of peace in the situation, and even before that, I started looking at it and I'm thinking, whatever that was not healthy.
mhm,
Whatever that reaction was doesn't make sense.
mhm,
And it caused me to look at everything a little deeper. And it caused me to look at my own beliefs where like I'm not worried about people, but all of a sudden I'm panicked. I'm like, what do I really believe? What do I really want to hold on to? And around this very same time, I had a friend who was the Mormon church is very patriarchal, and it's led by men. Women, uh, even at the very top, it's a worldwide religion, and there's leaders that serve over the worldwide church. The local leadership is unpaid, but the worldwide leadership, the general leadership, is paid. What I learned was so it's literally I don't even know how many men. It's like 60 men. Like there's 15 kind of like head, and then there's another probably 60 that are serving all over the world in this general leadership role. And they're paid, they're compensated. They've left their professions and they're compensated for their work.
mhm,
There are 9 women who are in general leadership.
mhm,
So imagine what that looks like if you look at a leadership map. You've got 60 men and 9 women.
mhm,
And what I discovered was all these men were compensated, and yet there was these women who were in this role who had left professions like being an attorney, for example, and were not being compensated. And they weren't even reporting
mhm,
to the top people. They weren't even engaged at that top level. They were um and I couldn't unsee this inequality in leadership. And I started to notice that what was being said over the pulpit may be really good for men who, again, generalizations, but men tend to be more ego driven, more
mhm,
individualistic, more encouraged in that way in society. And women tend to be the givers. They're the mothers and the givers, and that tends to be, again, generalization. But the things that were coming over the pulpit was quit being so selfish, give more, give more. And this might be really helpful for men, but there's the women over here that are suffering with this message because I don't have another ounce to give. In fact, at one point, I was homeschooling my children. I'd gone to a women's meeting. There was a man speaking at the meeting, which is another thing. You know, men always spoke at the women's meetings. Women never spoke at the men's meeting. One time I was invited to speak at the men's meeting, and I got there, and all the men were walking in going, "You're not supposed to be here." Um, I'm like, I was invited. But this man was speaking to us, and he said, you know, again, it was this message of don't be selfish, don't spend so much time in the
Mhm,
mall, don't spend so much time, look at your life,
mhm,
see where you can let go of the selfish worldly things and serve more. I was homeschooling my kids at the time, teaching piano lessons, serving in my church community.
mhm,
And I came home and I told my husband, I said, so we got this message and I've thought about it a lot. And I've decided what I'm going to give up is laundry.
good for you.
And my husband laughed and he says, oh, you've already done that. Remember, I had six kids, so I was laundry everywhere. So that was kind of a humorous moment. But I was, talking to this friend who had been talking to her bishop about her somewhat recent divorce and talking and, sharing about, and he was so empathetic. And then he ended up calling someone in her former husband's congregation, and the next time she saw this man, he says, well, I talked to this, other person. They said he was great and then dismissed her and, didn't no longer did she feel that concern. So I was
Mhm,
seeing these patterns. I was seeing these patterns in the women I was working with. I was seeing these
mhm,
patterns with my friends. I was seeing these patterns in my own life. And all that was corresponding with what happened with my daughter when she left.
mhm,
And yeah, I just, at that point, I was like, I really started to see the gulf between what I believed and what was
mhm.
being taught.
Yeah. You know, Julie, I'm listening to you. I can relate because it took me a long time to leave, even after I realized that things were just not what I was experiencing. The reality in the church that I was being told was different from the one I was experiencing and living. It does take a while. So this is one of the reasons I started this podcast. I want to bring on stories such as yours because I really believe that it gives others permission to even believe in themselves that they're not going crazy.
Yeah.
Because that's the other thing, right? When the leadership is controlling and you're having these independent thoughts and it's not aligned with how they think, the doubts start creeping in as well. So,
Yeah, and you have no one to talk to
yes,
because
right.
you can't talk to the people
Mhm.
that are in because
Mhm.
then you become a problem. You
Yes.
become, the issue instead
Mhm.
of, and so when I started seeing these, relational issues, these very um I'm going to say human issues,
Yeah.
then that gave me permission to kind of look behind the curtain a little more.
Hmm.
And I
Yeah.
started just looking behind the curtain and seeing that the history of the church, the actual history of what happened, is very
Hmm.
different than the narrative that is taught. The
Hmm.
narrative that is taught by the missionaries, the narrative that we hear every week at the pulpit,
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
very different than what actually happened.
Hmm.
And the historical record shows that. And I've actually had, and when I discovered all these things, everything started to make a lot more sense. It was like all those questions I'd had all those years, all of a sudden, like, oh, that's what happened. This is actually not what is it's purported to be.
Hmm.
And that all started to make more sense. But there was something else interesting that happened during this period. And I just started to kind of experiment um with I would wake up and I'd go, do I feel like going today? And I would say, yeah, I do. So I would get up and I would go. And other
Hmm.
days I'd be like, no, I don't. And I wasn't seeing a big difference between when I did and when I didn't because I had
Hmm.
internal spiritual practices. I didn't need this congregation. But a couple years ago, I was traveling with my husband. We were on a road trip, and remember, he'd left the religion, a few years before. And I said to him on this trip, we were 15 minutes into a 4-hour drive. And I said to him, I said, "What do you think I think?" And he said, "I think you think I'm going to hell." And I said, "Nothing could be further from the truth." And I told him what a magnificent spirit he was and how beautiful I saw him and how like just this hard to express beauty that I saw in his spirit and who he is at the depth of him. And it didn't matter his belief system or his religious belief system. This is who I saw him at the core. But here's the crazy thing that happened, Pooja. We were on a 4-hour drive and we were having this discussion, and I was sharing all this with him. And I looked up. I thought we'd been talking for 15 minutes, maybe 30 minutes. And I looked up and we were 15 minutes from our destination. Somewhere in there, we had like, I don't know where we went, but it was the most incredible thing. And as we stopped at a grocery store, and as we were walking into the grocery store, I was sharing with him some of my beliefs and some of my thoughts about God and the things that I'd been taught
Mhm.
by God because of my experiences with losing my children and learning to connect with them and learning to connect with spirit at a higher level and so forth. And I was sharing some of these things with him, and he says, "Well, why doesn't the church teach that?"
Mhm.
And I started to say, and I don't even remember what I started to say, but I started, to explain, oh, this is, blah, 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 whatever.
Mhm.
And in my head, I heard, I can't defend this anymore.
Mhm.
And that was the beginning of the end. But you asked about the loss of community.
Mhm.
For me, it was a little different because we had moved,
Mhm.
and we had moved from one congregation across country to where we live here in Nashville.
Mhm.
And I was not as embedded in that community.
Mhm.
All this happened, all this began to happen shortly after we moved here.
Mhm.
And so that was less of a concern, but also still a concern because I had so many beautiful friends all over the country
Yeah.
who still thought of me as that, good Mormon girl that was doing all the things. And
Yeah.
eventually I began to share on Facebook about my religious deconstruction because I could no longer have people assume that I was still
Mhm.
in this system. So,
And I'm glad you brought that up, Julie, because that question popped in my head. I understand not so much about the community, but my question was going to be about your identity.
mhm.
Because it's very hard to separate our religion from our identity and our purpose, even sometimes. So,
100% because
yeah,
you've read my book Miracles in the Darkness, and that
yeah,
just came out 5 years ago.
yeah.
And I wrote that book very much still
Mm-hmm,
involved in the community and very much still considering myself both
mm-hmm,
religious and spiritual.
mm-hmm,
I had for a number of years separated those things and realized
mm-hmm,
that religious and spiritual are two different things. So that was a
mm-hmm,
blessing to me that I had separated those two things.
mm-hmm,
But when I wrote my book, I was very much involved in the
mm-hmm,
community. And I very much saw my story around that religious tradition. And I did begin to, and here's where, God just helped me untangle and realize that whatever religion we're in, whether we're religious, not religious, whether we're atheist, whether we're agnostic, whatever we are,
mm-hmm,
my belief is that God's going to bless us wherever we are.
mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
I have had spiritual experiences reading a book like To Kill a Mockingbird.
yeah.
And so I've had spiritual experiences listening to rock music. I've had spiritual experiences walking down the beach.
Mm-hmm,
It wasn't dependent on the religion. And I began to see that all of the experiences that I had within the religion were blessed me at the time
Mm-hmm.
because that was my belief system. And it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't in it wasn't in my soul plan for God to
Mm-hmm.
rip me out of there, 40 years ago.
That's what I tell myself. The timing is just right. But Julie, listening to you, I do have a comment. It popped in my head when you were talking about your husband and, the question he asked, why doesn't the church teach that? And you know what popped in my head? Because religion is always about staying in your box. So
Yes.
anything that expands and stretches has the danger of breaking down those barriers, then the box is in danger,
Yes.
right? So it's something like that. Even the leaders are taught to fiercely protect the bylaws and the doctrines and the traditions. So it's kind of I feel sad because I think religion is a great way that people learn to connect. Most people do in society, right? Learn to connect with the higher power. But
Hmm.
then once it's you outgrow that, right? And
Yeah.
we're able to hear from our soul. And speaking of which, I know you're incredibly intuitive, Julie. Did you start having these? Because I know you could tune into angel messages. Did you experience this already, right? While you were still a part of the church, but like you said, your spirit and your religion was separating. Did you find that talking about that was hard? Because in some religious circles, it's forbidden to speak to angels or to hear from the spirit world. So did you have a struggle with that?
Absolutely. And it was interesting because some people really embraced the messages that I was sharing, and some people were really afraid of what was happening. Um, in the LDS faith, there is talk of angels and there is experiences with angels, but it's more like these are things that happen in the scriptures.
Yes.
Um, and some people were open to that idea that it could happen to regular people,
Mhm.
and some people weren't. And so it was a mixed bag. And definitely I found myself often because I was a scriptorian. Like I studied scripture.
Mhm.
I taught they had a seminary class for high school
Mhm.
students every morning before they went to high school. I taught that class for a year and a
Mhm.
half. So I was very trained in
Mhm.
scripture, and so I would grab onto things that aligned with what I was feeling and sensing and
Mhm.
understanding. And then the things that didn't align, I would go, okay, I don't know what that is. I don't know how that works, but I'm
Mhm.
going to hold on to these pieces. And that's
Mhm.
one of the things that kept me there
Mhm.
for a while. But yeah, it's the identity thing is a real, and what I've noticed is that a lot of people leave the Mormon church and become agnostic or atheist. A lot of
Mhm.
them just deconstruct God in the process of
Mhm.
deconstructing religion.
Mhm.
And the more vocal ones tend to
Yeah.
do that. I'm finding that there's a lot of people who haven't done that, but they're not as vocal. And so, yeah, so it's a challenging thing when that's what you were raised in and that's what you believed, and then you no longer believe it. And so then you're
Mhm.
like, okay, well, what do I now believe about God? And religion has a certain amount of certainty to it,
Mhm.
especially the
Mhm.
Mormon church, because
Mhm.
they have like this whole thing about like what happened before we came and why are we here and where are we going, and there's a lot of certainty within that structure, and it's hard to leave the certainty and be okay in this space of trusting God
Mhm.
and knowing that everything that you taught, that everything that you were taught is not actually fact or true,
Yeah.
and having to rediscover what you do believe in. And the only thing I can say at this moment in time is my certainty is in God.
And that's beautiful. It's always make me very amused, right? That faith, by definition, right? If you look at, if you even try to like unpack what faith is, it's not about certainty. If you're
Hmm.
certain, you don't need faith.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? So that is very beautiful. And Julie, I don't want to let you go. Our time is about to close, but I still have two more questions. So I'm going to
Okay.
hold on to you for a few more minutes. And you alluded to it a little bit. So where have you landed now in terms of faith and or beliefs, I should rather say? Um, how do you connect to God?
So I connect with God very much through spirit, very
Mm,
much through angel messages. I, uh, I receive. I was like, where did this come from? But I just received these downloads, and I was like,
mhm,
where is all this coming from? And then I realized that since 2010, since
mhm,
my healing experience, I've been filling notebooks
mhm,
with questions and um, and answers that have come through intuition and through
mhm,
spirit. And it has just that has just grown and grown
mhm,
exponentially, and that connection with the angelic realm and being able to do that. And when I and I think it's really, from my grief experience, leaving your religion, leaving a community is a grief experience.
mhm,
Discovering that the faith that I had believed in all these years was not what I thought it was like finding out that my first husband was cheating. I mean,
mhm,
it was impactful to discover that. And it is so much a grief experience. And so there is going to be a period of leaving, and when we have any kind of a grief experience, whether it's a death of a loved one or faith transition or any grief experience, our foundation feels like it has gone through an earthquake. It is unsteady, it's rubble, and we're building a new foundation.
mhm,
And so if that's an experience that someone is listening is going through, recognize that this is a grief experience and
mhm,
it's okay to go through the pain. It's okay to feel angry.
mhm,
If we go back to the 5 stages of grief that
mhm,
Dr. Kubler-Ross suggested, one of those is anger, one of those is depression. Having these experience of feeling even disconnected from spirit or God can make us question, should I have left?
mhm,
But then when we look at it and we say, well, I can't go back to where I was.
mhm,
I my only option is to move forward. And so I allowed myself to feel that
mhm,
frustration, that anger, that depression, that feeling like, who am I now? Redefining myself. That is just part of the process of moving from one belief system into, and that's another thing that's challenging. It's like, where do we go from here? Do we find another religious community that better fits our needs, or do we go it alone and create our own spiritual community, which I feel like you're part of mine. Um,
Same.
and so all these questions are open to be answered, and there is
Mhm,
no right or wrong answer. And
mhm,
that's what I've learned from God, is that there is no right or wrong answer. It
mhm,
is God supports us in all of our exploring, in all of our travels, in all of our journeys. God has no expectation that we're going to land in a certain place or we're going to
mhm,
worship him in a certain way. It's whatever feels correct for you. I've experimented with going to, other congregations, and in Nashville it's fun because they have great music.
Yes.
There's some great artists out here, so it's a lot of fun. And I found a community that like feels 100% like the place for me? No. When I see, oh, this was based on somebody's teachings, I'm like, well, I'm not interested in following one person's teachings. I'm interested in what God has to say. So we just experiment and we just go, okay, does this feel correct? And just because it feels correct now, if in a month from now it doesn't, that's okay too. Like experiment, allow yourself to feel all the feelings that you're feeling, allow yourself to feel sad, allow yourself to feel disappointed if you've
Mhm.
felt you've been let down by a community that you loved, or by family members that you've loved. Um, I don't know. That was a long answer to your
No,
question.
you answered both my questions because my very last question was going to be, do you have any words of advice for those that are shifting and deconstructing? And you answered that, Julie.
Yeah.
Every word has spoken to me today. This has been very, very good for my soul. And I love that you said that God doesn't have expectations wherever we land. And one of the things while I was deconstructing that helped me is how do I feel? Do I feel like my soul expands when I'm exploring this, or do I feel constricted, right? I
Hmm.
used that as a guide for many, many months to help me gather, and right now I feel like my spiritual practice is not one thing anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's several things, put together.
I agree. It's meditation. It's writing words of wisdom that are coming
Yeah,
through. It's all the things. It's looking at a sunset and just being in awe of the
yeah,
beauty of nature around us. It's
yeah,
it's all of the things. And I know that, people who are still in religion, and I have such love and respect for people
yeah.
who are, some people think that, I hate people who are religious. That could not
No,
be further from the truth. I absolutely love. I was there not that long ago,
yeah,
and so, but when I share things like, you know, God doesn't have expectations, that is a really hard concept if we've been in a religious structure that says here are the rules.
mm-hmm.
And I think in God's eyes, we're all toddlers toddling around trying to figure it out,
Yeah,
standing and falling and standing and falling, and God's just there bolstering us up and sending angels to uh, light our way. And there's just a lot of beauty in personal spiritual sovereignty and spiritual independence. So
thank you for saying that, Julie. I love that. And I was just thinking, I wanted to mention, I don't want to forget, I will have the link to our first interview in the show notes. So if anybody's interested in doing a deep dive into your story, your journey with grief, and how you came about to be a grief specialist. And also, I would love for people to find you and the work that you're doing with the grief coaching, because I also believe what you said earlier, when you lose your community, your religion, and even your worldview, it can feel like grief. It really does.
it
So
is
if anybody is,
100%.
needing to find some
Yeah.
answers, I want to direct them to your website, to your
Yes.
Instagram. So I'll have all those links. But is there anything else you want me to include? So I have your Instagram,
Yeah.
you have the podcast, Light the
Yeah.
Day. So I'll
Yes. Yes.
include that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So reach out to me on Instagram, reach out to me at my website. I am going to start talking about this more, religious deconstruction. I've been studying for the last couple of years, I've been studying religious harm, religious trauma, and how that affects us. And it affects us in a lot of ways that are not readily seen. Some things are obvious, other things are not as obvious. So
Yeah. Yes. Thank you so much, Julie. I appreciate you coming on
thank you.
again. Thank
I
you.
love it.